You're listening to CBC Online at cbchs.org.
CBC Online, we are checking in with Dave Lange, author of a new book called Soccer Made in St. Louis, A History of the Game in America's First Soccer Capital. And Dave, I got to tell you, there's been great coverage of CBC. How does CBC soccer fit into the tapestry of St. Louis soccer when you look at it as on the whole?
Well, first of all, what sets St. Louis apart from every other country in the nation is that it developed its own players starting in the late 1800s. And no other city in the United States was doing that until the 1970s. And a big reason for that was Christian Brothers College. The brothers who staffed the college, at that time it was a college as well as a high school. And the brothers brought soccer over from Great Britain, and they taught it to the kids, not only at CBC, but in the parishes that they staffed in St. Louis. And that was really the start of the CYC, which was the great network of Catholic youth teams, which was responsible for turning out all these great players over the years.
So give us a time period. We're talking turn of the century? Or?
It would be in the late 1880s. The first game I could find in the newspapers was in 1875, and it wasn't long after that, in the early 1880s, where the brothers were starting to teach soccer to the kids at CBC. And in fact, they specifically would bring brothers over from England who were familiar with the sport just so they could teach it to the kids.
So when you look at, back in the 1800s, what kind of game was it? I mean, was it anything close to the game we see today? Probably not.
It was a game. It was much more rigid. I mean, if you were a back, a fullback, you stayed back. You didn't go up. The formations were different. The tactics were different. St. Louis was known as a very physical type of soccer. It was said that, it was unusual to have a game where there wasn't a fist fight sometime during it. Wow. But it was a very rough and tumble type of game in those days.
So were the fights between the brothers or the players?
It was between the players, but not at CBC after they got out and started playing in the leagues around town.
Sure. So talk to us a little bit after the turn of the century. How did this thing kind of catch fire here in St. Louis? It went into the CYC system and then just kind of grew from there?
It kind of grew from there. There was a guy named Tom Cahill in St. Louis who was very important as far as being an administrator. He started actually the U.S. Soccer Federation around 1912, and he brought a team over from England to tour the United States, the first time it ever happened, and he made sure they came to St. Louis. And having these kids already playing at CBC and elsewhere, and they saw a team from England play here in 1905, it really sparked a huge amount of interest and kind of took it to the next level. And from there, all the great players started coming out from St. Louis.
Now, I noticed in your book there's some great nostalgia myself. I'm a child of the 80s. I love the Steamers. You certainly cover the whole Steamers era. Talk about the game as it's evolved here in St. Louis. I mean, some might say that indoor soccer was a bit of a circus act. And, what was your take on that?
Well, I had to learn a lot about the games. I wound up having to coach my son's team at Bush Soccer Club for 10 years. And one of the integral parts of any practice session, and Terry Mickler will preach about this for hours, small-sided games. And indoor soccer is really just a small-sided game where they play 5-on-5 plus goalkeepers in a small area. And it distills soccer right down into the essence of attacking and defending and eliminates the midfield. So it was very much it wasn't a gimmick at all in my estimation. It was just what every soccer coach does at every practice. And he plays a small-sided game, and that's what indoor soccer is.
And you've studied the game from the 1800s all the way to the current. You talk about the Kutis teams of the early 50s, 60s. You talk about that era. Well, you don't even hear about Kutis, but they were the franchise.
Kutis was probably the best team in the United States in the 1950s. Harry Keogh was the driving force behind that team. Plus, they had a great sponsor in Kutis who's provided all kinds of money to send a team all over the nation to play. They're the last team in U.S. history to win both the Amateur and Open Cups in the same year, and they won 6 National Amateur Cups in a row. So they were the dominant team in terms of both winning and the way the game was played. They played it much differently than anyone ever played the game up to that point.
So as you look at the St. Louis market, and let's say specifically high school soccer, because that certainly is where our audience is concerned. Talk about the evolution of high school soccer. Boy, we've had some great stars come out of here. From Daryl Duran all the way up to the Twellman young man, Taylor Twellman, who's now on national broadcast. So talk about St. Louis as a hotbed for soccer talent.
It's funny because in a lot of other cities they had high school soccer as part of the program. In St. Louis, it wasn't really played much in high schools except in the Catholic high schools. And it wasn't until the late 60s that the state association actually sponsored the state championship. Up until that point, when soccer was played in the winter, there was the CYC Christmas tournament, and whoever won that was considered a state champion because really no one out of St. Louis really played soccer in Missouri. But that plus the senior soccer was responsible for generating all these great players. Almost every high school you could think of who was playing soccer at that time turned out big-time players. Even Prep South, which was feeder to the seminary, turned out people like Al Trost. Bob Gelker, who was one of the driving forces behind soccer in the United States and St. Louis, got his start as a coach at Prep South. So almost every high school you can talk about, they have their own tradition of turning out excellent players.
Again, we're on CBC Online. We're checking in with Dave Lange. He's the author of Soccer Made in St. Louis, a history of the game in America's first soccer capital. And I guess my question is, why this book and why now?
There's two reasons. First of all, as soccer's caught on in the rest of the United States, the story of St. Louis as being the first soccer capital has kind of gotten lost in the mists of time, and nobody's ever really done a book. So one of the purposes was to get this story on the record so people can read about it and see how important St. Louis was to soccer in the United States. The second reason was to get the stories of the people who played and administrated the game onto writing before it's too late, because nobody's getting any younger. So those are the two reasons for the book. And real quick,
what are two things that really stuck out during your research about in doing this book? Some things that kind of stuck out for you.
I guess it was the fact that I didn't realize that St. Louis had been playing soccer all the way back in the 1870s. I mean, they didn't even formalize the rules of the game until 1864 in England. And less than 10 years later, you're reading about games here. The other one is, I knew CBC was an integral part, but I didn't realize how important it had been to the growth of soccer in St. Louis in the very beginning. And almost every big-time player you read about in the 1910s and 1920s is a CBC alum.
Wow. Great. Tell folks how they can get the book. You'll have it available through St. Louis, is online. How do we get the book?
The book is available at Barnes & Noble, and it's online at Amazon and Barnes & Noble's online. And then we have an event on September 7th at the Missouri History Museum. That night we're going to have a panel discussion about St. Louis and U.S. soccer, and we're having 5 very significant soccer personalities, not just in St. Louis, but in U.S. soccer, who are going to be on the panel. Dan Flynn, who's the number 2 guy in U.S. soccer, will be on the panel. Lori Kolupny, who has represented the United States for many years in the U.S. national team, will be there as part of the panel. Mike Sorber, who's the assistant coach in the men's national team, will be on the panel. And Pat McBride and Al Trost, U.S. Soccer Hall of Famers, will be on the panel. So that's
wow, it's pretty good lineup. I mean,
yes.
There's a lot of power.
Yeah,
there.
we're looking forward to that, and there'll be a book signing afterwards with those people available.
Sure. Just when you look at those names, though, it's really interesting. You talk about Lori, with certainly what she's been able to do. Pat McBride, what he's been able to do. Al Trost. What a interesting, eclectic group of people. It should be a pretty good night.
Oh, it should be an excellent night. You're going to get the perspective of somebody like Pat and Al, who's been here playing soccer for many years, and a perspective of somebody like Mike Sorber, who not only knows the game from the national level, but goes overseas all the time to evaluate American players who are playing overseas. So he brings that perspective as well.
Good stuff. Again, Soccer Made in St. Louis. It's a great book. I have a copy myself. Looking forward to it. We'll be back with you next time on CBC Online. Thanks, Dave.
CBC, Men for Tomorrow, Brothers for Life.